We will continue on now with our last 6 orders of soil taxonomy and then some final notes about soil classification. So aridosols are next up, and the name suggests aridic environments, and that's basically what these are, soils. They've got to have some development, and they are in desert locations. They're defined by their climate and a little bit of development. So dry most of the year. We don't expect fast development. A well-developed aridosol is often fairly old, or maybe the climate has changed, maybe it formed in a wetter environment, or in some cases there are inputs, additions of dust that can be important, but different processes than in many other soils because there's not a lot of water movement in these soils. The map of aridosols is a map of the desert southwest, basically. This soil photo shows some biological soil crusts, which are kind of a cool feature of many aridosols, these organisms that create these communities on the surface of soils and actually act as dust traps and help with the development of the soils. In addition to being one of the few sources of carbon, they're also trapping nutrients and dust. So kind of a cool desert environment specific soil feature. Ultisols. Ultisols think ultimate development. They're actually not quite as developed as the oxasols, but they're really developed. So the memory device only half works, but highly developed soils. They are strongly leached, and they have had most of the basic nutrients washed away. So they're relatively acidic and relatively low fertility. They also have to have clay accumulation. They will always have BT horizons, accumulation of clay subsurface, like an argillic horizon. An argillic or similar horizon are required for an ultisol. They're mostly in very humid areas, tropical. They are the most common soils in tropical locations, and they tend to be on old, stable landscapes because it takes time to leach away nutrients and relocate that clay. Here are a couple images of ultisols. Pretty different soils here, but the common theme is they have accumulated clay and they are highly leached, and the nutrients, the base cations, have been washed away. They are very common in the southeastern U.S., the red soils of the south, mostly ultisols. They are common in California, up in the Sierra foothills, right about 4,000 feet. There's just kind of this line where their precipitation increases as you go up in elevation, and kind of at the peak zone of maximum tree growth, maximum precipitation, maximum rain. You get more precipitation, but it gets cold and snowy up above that line. So there's just kind of this thin band, usually pretty close to 4,000 feet. Next time you drive up into the Sierras, if the area in the Sierras you drive up to is not burned away, I am going to be looking for a new location in the Sierras to drive to, but for the next couple of years anyway. At some point you're probably going to be looking out the window thinking about the soil, because obviously you would be doing that. And at some point you're going to say, whoa, that soil suddenly got red. Check the elevation. Next time you see an elevation sign, see if you're at 4,000 feet. I bet you're pretty close, and it's probably an ultisol. Mollisols. Mollisols have a mollic epipedon. Hopefully that one's not too much of a stretch. And they are most commonly found in grassland settings. The idea of the mollic epipedon, this thick, dark, carbon-rich horizon, the way we get that is with grass roots, these nets of roots that go deep into the soil and just distribute carbon evenly throughout. So typically in grasslands, dark, thick surface horizons. Plant roots putting organic matter into the soil, and they also, by definition, they have to have a lot of these basic nutrients that are also plant nutrients. They tend to be some of the most fertile soils on Earth. They're carbon rich, they are prime for growing grass because that's usually where they develop, and a lot of our crops like wheat are grass or grass-like, and they have a lot of nutrients present. So very productive soils for agricultural use. This is a good mollisol landscape, and lots of mollisols in the U.S. Much of the Midwest are mollisols. A lot of our local soils, we have lots of mollisols on campus. Coastal grassland locations, and even some of our coastal forests get enough carbon inputs that we have the right setting to develop mollisols. Right, so again, that's 3 more orders. We're up to 9. Here's your chance to take a little break, pause the video, get a drink maybe, and while you're doing that, think about iridosols, ultisols, mollisols. How would you summarize them? Key points about those 3. Take some notes, check your notes, and now that you're back, we'll hit 3 more orders, our last 3. Alphasols. Alphasols are cousins to ultisols, but not as developed. They are moderately leached. So ultisols are highly leached, alphasols moderately leached. They have clay accumulation, like an argillic horizon. An argillic or similar horizon. There are a couple other options that count, but most commonly an argillic horizon will get you an alphasol. And we have to have some bases there, more than 35% base saturation, which is a chemical evaluation that we'll talk about later in the quarter. But plenty of those: calcium, sodium, magnesium, potassium. The most common scenario, kind of the typical model for where do we form an alphasol, is under a deciduous forest, where we've got decent inputs of carbon, but not like grass-like inputs, because then we'd have a mollisol instead. So the carbon is maybe more focused in a thin O horizon, or not as deeply concentrated as a mollisol. But then the broadleaf vegetation cycling those bases and keeping them from leaching out of the system. That's sort of the default model when they came up with the concept. That's what they had in mind. There are actually a lot of these I'll show you in the Central Valley which don't fit that model. There are other ways to get there. But one way or another, we've got not too much leaching, but enough development for that clay-rich horizon to develop. They are relatively high fertility soils, pretty productive, and in California that is very true. A lot of our productive soils out in the Central Valley are alphasols. Also common in the Midwest, the hardwood forest zones. That's sort of the more traditional model over in here, but ours are often in grasslands, but just where we don't have as much carbon accumulation for different reasons. This image happens to be our California state soil, which I'm sure you all learned in 4th grade or whenever it is they focus on the state soil in elementary school. I'm assuming that is probably 1 or 2 weeks that they focus on that. Our state soil is the San Joaquin series, and it is an alphasol, subsurface clay accumulation, so an argillic horizon. It also has a durapan, one of these cemented layers. It's kind of a cool soil in terms of development. It's kind of a challenge if you want to actually grow anything on it, but an interesting soil. Next, our penultimate soil order are the inceptisols. If you think, the root word inception means like birth, from the start. We're near the inception of these soils, near their starting point. And so they've developed a little bit, but not much. They are characterized most commonly by a cambic horizon. So cambic means change. We've had a little change, but just not a lot of change. BWs are very common in inceptisols, that weak development. We don't have enough to get the T, we don't have enough for an argillic, but we're sort of on the way. It's a relatively young soil, or it's on a steep slope, or somewhere where development is going to be limited. And there are a lot of ways to limit development. Sometimes it has to do with the chemistry or drainage, how much water is in there, so that impacts water movement. Sometimes it has to do with parent material that is really slow to break down. Sometimes it's steep slopes, sometimes it's climate. So lots of different ways to get an inceptisol. And so as these images hopefully make clear, I mean, these soils look very different from each other. The common theme is they're not super developed. They're on very different trajectories for development, but they're just not very far down the road. So we get them scattered around but mountainous areas, up in the Sierras, and Cascades, and in California those are pretty common. Colder areas, we see a decent number of them. Appalachians, lots of inceptisols. So areas with limited development. Our last order, the entisols. And ent is from recent. So inceptisols they're just getting started, they're young soils. Entisols are baby soils. They haven't even gotten as far down the road as the inceptisols. Almost no development. Usually it's an A on a C, or an A on an R. We don't even have a B horizon that is developed because they are recently deposited. Any soil that doesn't fit one of the other soil orders, technically that's the definition of an entisol, but basically by the time we've gotten through an inceptisol, we've covered all of the different ways in which you might see a little soil development. So when we get here, we're generally just in very young soils that haven't had time to develop much. Steep rocky settings and floodplains next to rivers where you just get fresh deposition, those are common locations for entisols. And again, they can look very different depending on where you're at and what the sediment is that's being deposited, but the common theme is not much development. These rounded rocks are alluvium. That's a good example of a floodplain soil. This is a sandy soil, ochric epipedon, and nothing else down below in a dry climate, so not enough development to even be an iridisol. Here we've got stratification, different layers, and so we've got probably a floodplain, although maybe we're flooding on top of some different material. Anyway, common theme, recent deposition, and that can happen in a lot of locations around rivers, floodplains. That's a common place to find them, but scattered globally. All right, for the last time, you get to do your mental summary, check your notes, take a little pause here, and make sure you have a handle on alphasols, inceptisols, and entisols. All right, any questions you had, make sure you note those and see if you can track down an answer one way or another. To wrap up, we're going to do a little review and then we're going to give a little context for our order. So, I know it's been between 30 minutes and several days since you watched about epipedons, so we're going to quiz you a little, make you call back the information that you heard a little while ago. If you look at this soil, what is the epipedon? You don't have a lot of the technical information, but just what does your gut tell you? What does it look like? All right, you have an answer now, I trust. Does it look like an accumulation of organic material? If you thought it did, it doesn't. It's not dark, it doesn't look like broken down plants, so probably not histic or pholistic. Then our other two options that I've shared with you anyway are molic or ochric. Does it look thick and dark? And I would say no, that looks pretty pale to me. So if it's not dark, then it can't be molic. And that leaves, for everything else, ochric. So I think just kind of at a general concept level, probably ochric is your best guess here. What about the endopedon? You can't touch this soil. I haven't given you any lab data, but what does it look like? I would say it's definitely getting redder at the base, right? That looks like some development, and it looks pretty strong development down here. It's deep. That red color is going down, more than 5 feet. So, deep, thick development. Given that soils are clay factories, and this looks like a well-developed soil, my guess, I don't actually have any lab data on the soil, but my guess would be probably an argillic horizon here, because it looks well-developed. If I had to guess the soil order, with an argillic horizon and that much development, this looks kind of like an ultisol to me. Maybe it's an alpha sol, but if I had to just guess based on picture alone, I'd say that looks like some strong development, maybe an ultisol. And one more little review. What's the epipet on here? You can see that this soil material, this is a little plug that was pulled out. And we've got a 10 centimeter scale, so overall this is maybe 40 centimeters or something. You can see it's kind of wet down at the bottom because this was saturated with water. And it looks fibrous, like decomposing plant material. So this is a histic epipeton. Now, getting back to our soil orders. Distinguishing for classification. Well, how do you decide? And the answer is you ask yourself a series of yes or no questions. This is a simplified version from the textbook that gives the very basic version of each of these questions, the yes or no's, but it's a sequential thing. So the first question is, do you have permafrost near the surface? And if you do, meeting the very specific criteria, then you're a gelisol. And you don't move on to the rest of the options. So if you have an organic frozen soil that also, well, those two hard to overlap with very many others. But if it's both organic and frozen, gelisols wins because it comes first. So it's sequential. You work your way through and you ask a series of questions and you get at one answer. A soil can't be in two orders because once it hits one that it meets the criteria, then it has satisfied that. I've actually did my presentation, my slides, in the order that they appear here. So we started with the first thing that keys out and we ended with the last. And so it's in that same order that you work through and say, well, is it that? If yes, that's your answer. If no, you keep going. In terms of, so that's for classification. In terms of genesis, how they form, this is kind of a model. Generally speaking, we imagine that all soils start as an entisol, or most. Histosols, because they are organic from the get-go, they are kind of in their own world. But you start as an entisol, and then things change. And depending on how it changes, you can branch off in different directions. And this chart is generally showing increasing weathering. And so we get our low weathering gelisols and inceptisols and endosols near the beginning, and more developed soils as we move on. There are different ways of thinking about some of these, and this isn't always the pattern it follows, but generally speaking, the ultisols, oxasols, and spotisols are high development, and inceptisols, entosols, gelisols are less developed. So there are relationships, and you can move from one to the other. If you start with an entisol and weather it a little bit, you might get to an inceptisol. And if you keep weathering and leaching and accumulating clay, that could become an alphasol. And if you keep weathering that and leaching out nutrients, that could become an ultisol. And give it a couple 100,000 years of strong leaching, that could make it to an oxasol. So there are paths that these soils can follow in their development. The last thing about soil taxonomy, our system for classifying soils that I want to discuss, we've talked about our orders. And there are 12 soil orders, but every order is then divided into other groups that are called suborders. And the pyramid's getting narrower as we move down here because we're getting more and more specific at each step. But we're actually getting more and more possible. I don't know the number of suborders, but probably close to 100. maybe more like 50. By the time you get to series, there's something like 20,000 different series that have been described in the U.S. So more and more possibilities, but it's a more narrow, more focused definition. We're more specific as we work our way down. And these subdivisions are based on things like climate, based on distinguishing characteristics, diagnostic features, in some cases mineralogy. There are a lot of different things that we can use to get more and more specific and define a soil. When we name a soil, the full name of a soil looks something like this. Again, this is our San Joaquin State soil. The series, we just give it a name, like San Joaquin, which doesn't by itself tell you anything, but is just a easy to use identifier, a name that can be used to identify it's sort of the common name for the soil. And then the family name has all of this detail, and contained within the family name is a subgroup and a great group and a suborder. And finally, you'll remember I mentioned those formative elements, the 2 or 3 letter combinations. This one's an ALF. So what's the soil order for the San Joaquin soil? Alpha cells. So in this class, we aren't going to get any more detailed in terms of taxonomy than we have this week. But these names, these classifications, convey all kinds of information. If I run into a soil scientist from Minnesota and say, oh yeah, it's the San Joaquin, there's a good chance they won't know what that means. But if I tell her, well, it's a fine mixed active thermic abruptic Jerry-Z-Ralph, then she could go through, and it might take her a minute to process what I just said, but could tell me just about everything there is to know about that soil. So these names are very informative. At the order level, it's kind of a broad grouping, but then we add more and more detail as we name these soils. So to recap our system of classification that we've covered in this lecture, in these 2 videos, we've got our diagnostic features, a couple epipetons I want you to know, 4 of them specifically, a couple endopetons, 2 that I really want you to focus on, 12 soil orders, and then just kind of the general idea of how we then subdivide those into lower level categories of classification. Any questions you have, write them down, get them answered, and we will see you next week.